presentation without any further glitches. So today I'm going to be talking about my dissertation research that deals with fires in the boundary waters and their ecology. I'm assuming that a lot of you who are tuning in today are familiar with the boundary waters, but if you're not, it's about a 1 million acre wilderness that stretches along the Minnesota-Ontario border. And from a research standpoint, an ecology is really an exceptional place to do research. About 400,000 acres of the wilderness was never logged, and so there's intact disturbance histories on the ground, and so we actually know quite a bit about the ecology of this system. In addition, it's also had a number of large fires recently that are my primary area of interest. And there we go, next slide. So historically, we know that, like I said, because a lot of the wilderness wasn't logged, scientists were able to go in and measure past fires using things like tree rings and fire scars. And we know from the work of Bud Heinzelman and others that fires are really the dominant disturbance in this landscape. It's thought that historically fires were quite common. The dominant disturbance regime was probably one of crown fires, on average returning about every 100 years to any given stand. And of course, some areas probably burn more frequently than others, and other areas probably rarely, if ever, burned. For example, there's some new research done by Kurt Kiffmuller and others at the U of M that suggests that places like islands and areas along the portage routes probably burn more frequently, probably because of Native American fire use in those areas. They were having campfires and also probably doing some burning for management of blueberries and other species. So there's some areas that probably had more of a mixed severity fire regime, and then also areas, such as low-lying bogs that probably had much less frequent fire. Most of the big fires in the boundary waters we know occurred after periods of prolonged drought, usually periods of 2 or 3 weeks without rain. There isn't a lot of soil in this area. It's a lot of bedrock and a lot of topography, and so it actually dries out relatively quickly. And so just a few weeks without rain can be enough to have a fire start. And as you would expect for an area that has such frequent fires, most of the species that occur in the boundary waters have some adaptations for dealing with fire. For example, jack pine and black spruce both have serotinous seeds and cones that open up after fire, but there's other species such as paper birch and aspen that have really light, long distance dispersed seeds or are capable of stump sprouting or root suckering after fires. And so, if you're going to occur in this landscape with lots of fire, you have to have some way of dealing with it. Another thing that makes this an interesting place to do research is that it's kind of a mix of different species. Some are boreal and some are temperate. And like a lot of our forests in the upper Great Lakes region, we have kind of this mix, and we're at this ecotone between different biomes, between the boreal forest and the temperate. This slide just shows some of the range maps of the common species in the boundary waters that I'm going to be talking about today. On the top row, you can see the range maps for some of the boreal species, and on the bottom, you can see range maps for some of the temperate species. So if you look, red maple just barely makes it north into the boundary waters. It's basically at its northern range limit there, whereas species like black spruce, jack pine, and aspen are all found much further north normally. So there's kind of this dynamic tension going on here as well. So as I mentioned, fires, historically we've known have been the dominant disturbance in the boundary waters, but under climate change are expected to become even more frequent. This is from a 2009 paper in the International Journal of Wildland Fire, and basically the researchers used a couple of different climate scenarios and looked at predicted increases in fire weather indices, and they predict that the area immediately north of the boundary waters in Ontario is expected to have about 100% increase in fire occurrence by the end of the next century. So, in an area where fires occurred every 100 years, we might see fire frequencies more like 50 years in the future. So, as important as fires are to this landscape, they're likely to become even more so in the future under climate change as things become warmer and drier. Which kind of brings me to my particular study. And so the work I'm going to be talking about today is basically one facet of this much larger study that was investigating the role of multiple disturbances within the wilderness. The broader study looks at the 1999 Blowdown up there, which was a large wind event that basically leveled about 500,000 acres of the wilderness, and then was followed by 2 big wildfires. And it's mostly the wildfires that I'm going to be talking about today, and not so much the wind disturbance. So the 2 main wildfires I'm going to be talking about are the 2006 Cavity Lake fire and the 2007 Ham Lake fire. This is a fire progression map for the Cavity Lake fire. This was a fire that started on the east end of the Boundary Waters near the end of the Gunflint Trail. It was a lightning ignited fire that started burning in July of 2006. So this slide shows the progression. Each one of the colors here is how the fire moved on a given day. And this fire burned in a lot of areas that had been previously impacted by that 1999 blowdown. And as a result, tended to be a quite severe fire. This is a shot basically 1 year after the Cavvy Lake fire, and you can see that this fire really cooked. It burned right down to the bare bedrock and mineral soil and didn't leave a lot of organic material in its wake. Then a couple other fires I'll be talking about today were part of the East Zone Complex. This was a series of different fires that burned in the east end of the Boundary Waters in the fall of 2006. The two main ones I'm going to be talking about are the Famine Lake Fire and the Red Eye Lake Fire. These are relatively small fires, about 5,000 acres in total. And these, in contrast to the Cavvy Lake Fire, burned areas that were mostly unaffected by that 1999 blowdown. And then in 2007, we had the Ham Lake Fire. This was a very large fire that started as an escape campfire within the wilderness. This actually reburned some areas that had blown down and also were treated with prescribed fire by the Forest Service, as well as a lot of areas that hadn't blown down, burned into Canada, burned back into the US, and in total about 75,000 acres were burned in this fire. This again is the fire progression map day by day. You can see how the fire spread. And this one is basically right adjacent to the Cavvy Lake Fire. And it was a spring fire. So within kind of a small area of the wilderness, we have lots of different combinations of fire, including changes in seasonality and in severity, and it provides a really nice natural experiment to kind of look at some of these differences. This is a slide showing the Ham Lake Fire in July, just a few months after it burned, and you can see in this photo that's quite a different image than that Cavvy Lake Fire slide that I showed that again was a year after the fire. Here we are, just a couple months, and you can notice how green things are. And as I was starting to do this larger study about blowdown and fire in the Boundary Waters, I was really struck by how different these different fires looked, and was starting to try and figure out why are these fires so different. This is a slide kind of showing all the fires together. Basically, the spring fire here is the Ham Lake Fire shown in red, whereas the yellow outlines are showing both the Cavvy Lake, Famine Lake, and Red Eye Lake fires. So, and the gray here is showing the blowdown areas. So there's really kind of this unique mix of different disturbance conditions, all within an area of relatively similar forest vegetation and similar soil types. So, because we can't do really large experiments like lighting, 100,000 acres of forest on fire, we have to, investigate natural fires as case studies. And so this really presents, an awesome opportunity to answer a lot of questions about how fire plays out in boreal forest systems. And so, as I mentioned, as I was starting to do this research, I was really struck by differences between the Cavvy and the Ham Lake Fire. Again, here's two side-by-side comparisons. On the left-hand side, we have the Cavvy Lake Fire 5 years after fire, and on the right-hand side, the Ham Lake Fire. And just my initial gestalt was that, the Cavvy Lake Fire looked like it had burned a lot hotter, it was more severe, there was less regeneration. The Ham Lake Fire was much patchier, looked like it had burned cooler, and was much more heterogeneous in severity. And so because of that, I was suspecting that there might be some differences in the successional outcomes, in other words, how these fires had affected vegetation and what was coming back and how that might be different. And just a few more shots kind of up close, again, comparing the Cavvy Lake and Ham Lake Fire. Again, the Cavvy Lake, just the initial impressions I had was that the vegetation was sparser and that the Ham Lake was, coming back a lot stronger than the Cavvy Lake Fire. And I suspected that the seasonality of these fires probably played some role. And so that kind of led to this investigation I'm going to be talking about today. And so broadly, today I'm going to be talking about some of the questions I had regarding the seasonal timing of fire, in particular, how the seasonal timing of fire influences fire severity. And then in turn, does changes in fire severity influence succession? In other words, do you see different patterns happening at low severity versus high severity? And then kind of more broadly, when thinking about early and late season fires at the same severity level, do we see changes that are a result of just differences in severity, or are those differences in vegetation the result of just the timing of fire? Can we separate out the variability that comes from differences in fire severity from the variability that might be due to just when in the year that these fires are occurring. So one important caveat with all this research is that I really only have one replication from my early season fire. I'm only going to be talking about the Ham Lake fire, so it's only one fire. So in an ideal world, we'd have lots of replication, and we'd be investigating lots of early season fires. So we're going to try and infer as much as we can from this, but that's an important caveat when we're thinking about these results. So to answer these questions, I used a network of vegetation monitoring plots in the Boundary Waters Wilderness. These plots were arranged on transects across the landscape. The transects started at lake shores and basically ran uphill so that we captured the natural variation in the landscape from lakeshore to ridgetop. In total in the study, we had 1,086 plots along 85 transects. 682 of these plots were established in 2000 following the blowdown, and this was originally basically a blowdown study that we've kind of adapted to fire. 444 of those were resurveyed in 2011 and 2012, and then I added an additional 400 plots to the study in 2012. We used a nested plot design where we basically collected increasing levels of data as our plots got smaller. So for each one of our plots, we had a coarse scale radius plot that was 12.5 meters in radius. And here we basically were just counting trees, seeing what was left after the fire, what was still alive, and what had died in the fire. Within a 5 meter radius fine scale plot, we took detailed measurements of the trees, including the actual cause of mortality, their decay class, height, crown width, etc. And then we had a 3 meter radius plot where we were measuring regeneration. And in this 3 meter plot, we were counting basically all trees and woody shrubs, everything from new germinants up to seedlings and saplings. And so from that, we could look at, on the coarse scale plot, what was the vegetation like before fire, and then looking at that sapling and seedling plot, what was coming back after fire. So one of the major issues that I ran into in doing all of this research was the problem of how to measure disturbance severity. And a common definition of disturbance severity is that it's the proportion of individuals or propagules killed by disturbance. So in other words, this is the number of trees that are killed by disturbance, but also things like seeds stored in soil or root suckers, or basically anything that would allow vegetation to recover. And one of the problems is that there really isn't a good, universally applicable measurement. So what we ended up doing was using lots of severity metrics to try and capture how severe the fire was. So in some cases, we had categorical metrics where we basically assigned things from a 1 to 5 or 1 to 4 scale. And so we looked at things like crown fire severity. Basically, we tried to measure and quantify how much consumption of needles and twigs and branches had occurred in the fire. We looked at ground fire severity. In this case, we were trying to capture how much of the litter and duff had been consumed by the fire. We also had some quantitative measurements, including char height, which was a measure of fire line intensity. Char height basically equates to flame length, which gives us a measure of how much energy the fire is releasing. And then we also measured fire severity as the proportion of the plot level basal area that was killed by the fire. So just as an example, a value of 0 would be that all the trees are still alive. A value of 0.5 would mean that roughly half the basal area of the plot was killed by fire, and a value of 1 would be 100% or all the trees were killed by fire. So we had a quantitative measurement. And then we also were interested in how patchy the fire was, and the way that we assessed this was to look at that 12 meter radius plot and basically just try and estimate how much of that plot had actually burned. So again, because severity was difficult to measure, we used lots of different severity metrics. And we also weren't sure which severity metrics would be useful in terms of predicting changes in vegetation. Just to kind of illustrate some of these gradients in severity, here again we have that same slide comparing the Cavity Lake fire and the Ham Lake fire 5 years after fire. On the left, this would be categorized as being a ground fire severity of 5 in our metrics, which is a fire that would burn all of the litter and duff, expose bare bedrock and mineral soil, and basically leave nothing organic left after the fire. On the right-hand side, we have a low ground fire severity. This would be a value of 1 or 2 on our metric, which would indicate that the fire had consumed some of the surface litter, but basically none of the duff, and that there was still a lot of organic material left on the site. For the purposes of this analysis today, I've kind of condensed that 1 to 5 scale down into a simple high versus low ground fire severity, and that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about. So just to give you a visual of what high and low ground fire severity looks like on the landscape. So to answer these questions, used a variety of different statistical methods. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's, for today's audience, that's okay if you get a little bit lost here. So to get at whether differences in fire severity, or to get at whether there were really differences in fire severity based on the timing of fire, we use a multi-way ANOVA. And this was basically a way of controlling for differences in stand age and pre-disturbance composition and other factors that would likely also influence fire severity. So just as an example, we might expect that a jack pine stand might burn with a lot greater fire severity than a black ash stand, just because they're different forest types. So the multi-way ANOVA allows us to partition that variability and basically control for it. And so we're comparing apples to apples when we're interested in whether a fall fire was more severe really than a spring fire. Then to get at the issues of succession and change in composition, we used a couple kind of fancy methods, NMDS ordination, hierarchical cluster analysis, which were used to basically classify composition and compare changes before and after fire. And then we used successional pathway analysis to kind of get at how really these stands have changed before and after fire. And I'll talk a little bit more about the NMDS and HCA, because I'll talk about that more in the results. So to begin with, to try and give us a brief intro to these methods, one of the problems that we face in dealing with community ecology data sets is that it's really difficult to plot out the data because these data sets are multidimensional. You can imagine a very simple community of aspen and birch trees growing together, and you could measure how much birch trees there are and how much aspen trees there are. And you could actually plot that on a graph. You could have one axis that would be birch and another axis that would be aspen, and you could find a point. Well, if you start adding more species to that matrix, it becomes basically impossible to plot that out. If you have 10 or 12 species, you have a 10 or 12 dimensional data set, and there's no real way to graph that. So what NMDS does is it's a statistical technique that tries to reduce that dimensionality down into 2 or 3 dimensions so that we can actually plot it out in a graph. And kind of an analogy of how this works is if you can imagine like a jello mold with grapes in the middle, and that you showed a flashlight through that jello and projected the shadow of the grapes onto the wall, you would actually preserve some of the information about how those grapes are arranged in space within the jello. Even though they're in 3-dimensional space in the jello, 2-dimensional space on the wall, you're still retaining some of that distance information between, say, grape 1 and grape 2. And in the same way, NMDS basically does that with community data sets. So just as an example here, we have 3 different plots, and these have different compositions. So we have one plot that's 60% aspen, 40% birch, another one that's 40% aspen, 60% birch. These plots are really similar, and so what NMDS does is it'll plot those out in a 2D or 3D solution, and I'll put them really close together because they're really similar. If we have another plot that has, say, balsam fir in the mix, that plot's a little bit different, so NMDS will plot that out a little bit further away. So the distance in this graph that I'm going to show is basically just how similar things are. So things that are close together, quite similar. Things that are further apart are quite different. And then we use another technique called hierarchical cluster analysis, which basically was a way of categorizing these plots. We could have just looked at the data and said that all plots with over 50% aspen were aspen dominated, but this basically uses that ecological distance matrix to assign that in kind of a statistically based way. And so these are just some of the classifications that we came up with. We ended up with 8 community types defined by the data, and these graphs kind of show the composition. So on the top left, we have what we call the jack pine dominated community type. You can see that, roughly in these plots that were classified as jack pine dominated, about 65% of the basal area or 65% of the stems would be jack pine, but there's other things in the mix, including balsam fir and black spruce and aspen. And similarly for aspen, when the HCA analysis spit out a classification, it meant that these were generally speaking dominated by one species, but there's other species in there. And so then to kind of put this all together, we use successional vectors, which used our repeated measurements of plots to kind of track changes in space and time before and after fire. So again, keeping in mind that points closer together are more related and points further apart are less related, we could see how plots have changed in composition before and after fire. So as a hypothetical example again, let's say we went out in the field and we measured a plot, and our measurements in 2000 indicate that this plot was 60% jack pine, and the HCA then would classify it as a jack pine dominated plot. We could plot that same point in the future after we'd gone back after the fire and remeasured composition, and we could see how it changed. And let's say that our measurements of seedlings and saplings indicated now this is a paper birch stand. When this is plotted out in the ordination, it'll be further away, and basically that distance will tell us about how much that has changed in terms of community type. Okay, with that long-winded explanation of NMDS, now I can actually show you some of the results, and hopefully it'll make a little bit of sense. Eli, at this point, do I have any questions that have popped up? Or?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, I'll charge right into some of the results then. So this is an NMDS plot. Again, this was essentially a 12-dimensional data set that's been reduced in dimensionally down to 2 dimensions. And you can see these, each one of these points is basically a plot in our analysis. And the colors here indicate the community type that was assigned by the hierarchical cluster analysis. And on the left, we have the pre-fire composition, and on the right, the post-fire composition. And you can see that there was a net movement of plots from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the screen, and that some of these community types that were present before fire maybe aren't present after fire. So that's just kind of a general look at what we're finding, and I'll get into some of the specifics soon. So the first question I talked about trying to answer was, how does the seasonal timing of fire influence fire severity? Again, my first impressions when I was collecting this data is that these late season fires were more severe. And so, was that severity because they occurred later in the season, or was it because that maybe they were more jack pine dominated beforehand, or other things that would influence that? So I won't present all the ANOVA results, but I'll give you kind of a summary of some of those findings. What we found was that generally these late season fires burned more completely. They left fewer unburned patches. They tended to burn with greater depth. They consumed more of that organic layer. They consumed more of the litter and duff. And they also caused more mortality relative to the early season fires. So all the initial kind of impressions, basically, we found to be true when we were controlling for some of the other variability in terms of, again, this wasn't a perfect experiment. We didn't have exactly the same forest types before fire. So when we controlled for that variability, we still found that, yes, these late season fires were indeed more severe than our early season fire, the Ham Lake fire. One interesting finding is that we found essentially no difference in the fire intensity between these. So again, we were measuring char height, which is a proxy for flame length. Both of these fires were very severe, but they had different fire effects. Although the flames were just as high and the fire was burning just as hot in the early and in our late season fire, there ended up being more consumption of the organic layers in those late season fires. And so there may have been more smoldering combustion after the initial flame front passed through, probably because being later in the summer, those soil layers had more time to dry out. And this likely led to some of the increased mortality that we noted. We looked at differences by stand age. We had stands ranging from 60 years old all the way up to 200-plus-year-old stands. And we really didn't find much difference due to that. And generally found that kind of middle-aged stands tended to burn a little bit more severely than either really young or really old stands, but there wasn't much difference. And we did find that in some cases that community type played a role in influencing fire severity, in particular ground fire severity. We found that a lot of the pine community types, the red pine, white pine, jack pine, tended to burn more severely than, say, paper birch, black spruce, or balsam fir in terms of that organic layer. We had more consumption of those layers. And we found, kind of surprisingly, that the fire severity in terms of basal area change ended up being really a poor predictor. And actually, the most useful severity metric I ended up collecting was that ground fire severity. I initially was thinking when I was doing this research that what was happening above ground to the trees would really be driving patterns in succession and forest change, but really it was the consumption of the ground layer more than anything else that proved useful in explaining some of the patterns that I'll present shortly. So again, we have high severity fire on the left-hand side, lower severity fire on the right-hand side. And again, we found that there really were some differences between our Ham Lake fire and these late season fires in terms of how completely they burned, their patchiness, etc. In terms of how community composition changed, this is showing both our early season and our late season fires together. So kind of everything lumped into one analysis. This is showing basically those community types as defined by HCA analysis before and after fire. What we found was, in general, after a single fire like this, that we had large increases in the aspen community type, large increases in paper birch. And surprisingly, we found that jack pine, which is fire adapted, has serotinous cones, actually declined in dominance in some cases after fire. Also, sort of surprising, white pine and red pine, which are considered to be fire adapted, we found that, in a lot of cases where there were mature pine stands, when these burned, the fires were severe enough that they killed the pine. There wasn't seed source, and they oftentimes came back as something else. Likewise, a lot of our sort of longer-lived boreal conifers, things like balsam fir, black spruce, and white cedar also declined. So after these fires, really the big two winners were aspen and paper birch by a large margin. Now getting into some of the details between these two fires, we also took measurements in our seedling and sapling plots of woody shrubs, and so I'll present some of that data. One thing that was really striking is that there was a lot more shrubs present in the Ham Lake fire, which was our early season fire, than in our late season fire. This graph basically just shows our total stem count percentage between shrubs versus trees. And if you're a forest manager, the one on the left-hand side might give you pause, because we actually had more shrub stems on the landscape than tree stems. So, there's going to be quite a significant amount of competition from woody shrubs in the case of this early season fire than in our late season fires. Our late season fires, we had much more trees, relatively speaking. Again, we had probably fewer trees overall coming back in the late season fires because those were more severe, but those trees also had a lot less shrubs to deal with in competition.
How long was this after?
This was 5 years after fire.
Okay.
Yep. And here's some information on the shrub communities that we found. In both late season and early season fire, beaked hazel was the #1 shrub that came back. And I should preface this right away and say that we don't have pre-fire data on shrub abundance. So this is all, these differences could be just because they were different beforehand. They could also be different because the fires burned differently and were more severe, but we can't really separate those things. So just taking this with a grain of salt. Beaked hazel was the most dominant shrub in both late season and early season fires, making about a quarter of the shrubs that we found in the early season fires. Other species that did particularly well with early season fire include pincherry and tag and other green alders. If we look at the late season fires, we can see that beaked hazel did really well with late season fires, although again, total abundance of beaked hazel was less in these fires. But relative to early season fires, beaked hazel actually seemed to do better, relatively speaking. But again, if you're measuring beaked hazel in total, there'd be less of it in these late season fires just because there was less shrubs. We also found that willows tended to do a bit better in late season fires. But again, important caveat with this is that we don't have pre-fire data on shrub composition. So again, these results might be partly due to differences in shrub community composition before fire, but interesting nonetheless. So kind of to sum up some of these findings, we found that, again, beaked hazel was the most abundant shrub, both in early and late season fire, but made up a larger percentage of the stem count in late season fires. Alders and pincherry were more dominant in those early season fires. And as I mentioned, the caveat about no pre-disturbance data on shrub composition. So the other big question then was, we talked about how the forest changed. We saw that there was more aspen and birch coming back after fire and less pine. And then, we have these early and late season fires. Were there differences based on those fires? On the left-hand side, we have a couple different NMDS plots. On the right-hand side, we also have some NMDS. The left-hand side is showing the early season fires, and the right-hand side here is showing the late season fires. And again, kind of a basic explanation at NMDS, we're plotting the same points before and after fire. These vectors basically indicate how much changes occurred. I've grouped them by their pre-fire community type. So each one of these facets shows all the aspen plots before and after fire, et cetera. And then the colors indicate what community type they transition to after fire. So don't have to pay too much attention for right now. Just you can notice that the left-hand side looks different from the right-hand side, which would indicate that, yeah, we are actually seeing some differences in succession based on the seasonal timing of fires. So again, we talked about, aspen and birch are doing really well after fire, but if we start looking closer at this data, we find that there really is a strong seasonal pattern to why aspen and birch are doing well. In general, what we found was that aspen was really favored by early season fires, while paper birch was favored by late season fires. And that also, in our early season fire, we found that there's more variability in terms of how things would succeed after fire. Whereas in late season fires, most things kind of converge to a paper birch community type. One other interesting finding that we found was that black spruce tended to be a little bit more successful regenerating after early season fires, while white cedar actually regenerated a little bit better after late season fires. I'll get into some of those more differences now. So, the question then is, okay, we know that there are differences in fire severity between early and late season fires, and we know that there's differences in succession between these two fires. Well, the big question is that driven just by changes in severity, or is it driven by actually when these fires occurred within the year? And so these next few slides that I'm going to present are kind of trying to tease that apart and trying to separate variability due to fire severity from variability due to the timing of fire. This slide here is showing kind of everything together, but grouped by high and low ground fire severity and early versus late season fires. So the top two plots here are showing early season fire. The bottom two are showing our late season fire. And just the gestalt impression here again is that there's actually more similarity between high and low severity within a season of fire than between high and low severity between fire seasons. So in other words, if you look at the bottom two plots, they look more similar than, say, the top and bottom. So what this indicates is that actually the timing of fire may be more important than the fire severity effects that we're seeing. So although the late season fires burned hotter, that alone didn't explain all the patterns in succession that we were seeing and the differences between the relative success of aspen and paper birch. So this is a plot here, I pulled out just the paper birch stands. So these were stands that were classified as being paper birch dominated before fire, and then I've grouped them by early season fire on the left-hand side, late season fire on the right-hand side, and also high and low ground fire severity. And what you can see here is that there really isn't much difference between high and low ground fire severity within a given year or a given season of fire. In other words, just looking at paper birch on the two left-hand plots, these look quite similar. We're seeing that the paper birch generally succeed to aspen, and if we look at the right-hand side, that paper birch generally succeed to paper birch after fire. So what we found was that paper birch that was subjected to early season fire tended to be replaced by aspen, whereas paper birch that was subjected to late season fire tended to be replaced by paper birch. Now within that, we also found some variability based on fire severity. In general, with a more severe fire, we found that there was more aspen regeneration. So if we look all the way on the right-hand side, we have paper birch that burned in a late season fire and also in high severity, and we can see that there's some black mixed into that NMDS ordination, which indicates that it succeeded to aspen. But again, if we look at high versus low severity, there isn't a whole lot of difference between these. Most of the difference is just due to early versus late season fire. Again, similar slide here. This is just looking at the black spruce plots that we had in this study. Again, just your initial impression is that the two left-hand side plots look really similar and the two right-hand side plots look really similar. So again, although there were differences in fire severity going on, the seasonal timing of fire tended to be the big driver in what was going on in terms of compositional change. In general, we found that black spruce that experienced early season fire tended to regenerate to a mix of conifers and aspen, while black spruce plots that experienced late season fire tended to be replaced by paper birch. And that fire severity, again, had probably much less impact on succession than the seasonal timing of fire did, which was sort of surprising. So because this was a natural experiment, we don't have all these nice comparisons for all the community types. There were some community types that were more dominant in our samples before fire. This is just for late season fire for white cedar. Here we can actually see some effect in fire severity. On the left-hand side, we have low severity, and the right-hand side, we have high fire severity. And the interesting thing here is that white cedar plots actually regenerated really well with low severity fire. And white cedar is sort of thought of as being the species that's fire sensitive. It's a species that we oftentimes have a really difficult time regenerating, but like other conifers, it does well in a bare mineral soil seedbed. So in this case of low severity fire, we basically had almost like an underburn of a white cedar stand, and it seeded in really well. On the right-hand side, we have high severity, and we can see that there still are some of these white cedar plots in here, but we can also see there was a lot of conversion of those stands then to paper birch and aspen. So where you can have low severity fire occurring in cedar stands, it actually can regenerate quite well. And again, here we're actually seeing some differences in terms of the ground fire severity. But in a lot of cases, we were seeing bigger differences based on fall versus spring fire. And here again, this is jack pine plots. We didn't have very many jack pine plots in our late season fires. This is just for the early season fire. But again, we do see some effect of fire severity. On the left-hand side, we've got the low, and on the right-hand side, we've got high ground fire severity. You'll notice that on that right-hand side, there's a lot more orange plots. So a lot more jack pine plots regenerate as jack pine with high fire severity, which is to be expected. I mean, this is a species that we all know is adapted to fire as serotinous cones and really needs a bare mineral soil seedbed to regenerate. So it definitely tended to prefer those areas that burn more severely. As I mentioned at the beginning, we saw overall that there was a jack pine decline after fire in this study, which is sort of surprising. And I think partly this might be driven just by the fact that basically all of our jack pine stands burned in the Ham Lake fire, and we didn't have very many jack pine stands in the Cavity Lake fire or that Famine or Red Eye Lake fire. And because of this, that fire was overall of lower severity, and so possibly we had some of the situation on the left-hand side here where those jack pine stands were then replaced by paper birch or even balsam fir in a single case. So to try and sum up some of these NMDS graphs that I've presented, what we found was that the season of fire can really have a greater influence over succession than fire severity, which was sort of a surprising finding for me. We found that late season burning tended to favor paper birch over aspen and also led to a lot fewer woody shrubs. Early season fires tended to have more variable succession, have more shrubs when compared to late season fires. We did find some differences in fire severity related to succession. Again, high fire severity tended to favor aspen over paper birch, and high fire severity tended to reduce balsam fir abundance and white cedar regeneration while also increasing jack pine. So, then this research kind of prompts the question, why is fire season so important? Well, on the one hand, I've shown that, there are direct effects of, burning later in the season. You tend to have, more consumption of that organic layer going on. But as I've alluded to with this NMDS ordination, that doesn't explain all the variability that we're seeing. Although these late season fires tended to be more severe, again, we're seeing differences just based on fire season alone, which kind of brings up the importance of the phenology of the plants in question. And the interplay with that with seasonal timing of fire. So, in trying to explain, why did paper birch do so well in a late season fire and aspen do so well in an early season fire? One thing to keep in mind is that paper birch releases its seed in the fall, while aspen tends to release seed in the spring. So, although aspen isn't thought of as a species that does much seeding, in this case, in this study, we actually found that there was quite a bit of aspen seed regeneration, especially in that Ham Lake fire. I mean, that was an early season fire. Aspen released seed, and then we had a really kind of wet spring after the fire was put out. And that kind of created an ideal seedbed for aspen, and it was able to seed in, whereas, those late season fires occurred, July into September. Paper birch tends to release seed shortly after, and so it's possible that paper birch seed got a leg up on aspen then, which had to wait, a whole winter, before it could start up again. So the other thing to keep in mind is that plants actually have phenological windows of vulnerability. For example, we know from the work of Buckman that beaked hazel tends to be more vulnerable to damage in the summer once it's leafed out. I mean, some of the long ago studies of prescribed fire and beaked hazel found that, early season fires, if you're trying to manage for hazel, tend to just kind of make the hazel more aggressive. In that early season fire before it's leafed out, all the energy of that plant is stored in the soil. And so that fire might come through and top kill the stems of the hazel, but it's not really getting at that energy store in the soil. Whereas, once the plant has leafed out, it's expended a lot of energy to grow new leaves. And if you hit it with fire at that point, it's a lot more vulnerable to fire because it doesn't have that energy reserve then to recover from. And so likewise, aspen, those aspen stands that burned in our late season fire tended to be hit a lot harder than if they were burned in an early season fire. So kind of the takeaway message here is, when thinking about fire and use of fire on the landscape, it's important to think about not only the fire effects that are going to occur with an early versus a late season fire, but also how individual species are going to be able to respond based on their own phenology. I mean, species leaf out at different dates, they produce seed at different dates. And what this research sort of suggests is that those factors might be even more important than fire severity, which tends to be a lot of our focus. So to conclude, again, timing of fire matters, both, as I said, in its effects on fire severity, but also its indirect effects on forest succession due to phenological windows of vulnerability. Direct effects of late season fire severity may actually have less impact on succession than indirect effects due to, as I mentioned, differences in morphology and phenology between species. And then kind of more broadly, when thinking about climate change and increased fire in the future, fire seasons are going to change. We're probably going to have longer fire seasons, and are we going to see more spring fires versus fall fires? We really don't know at this point, but if there are differences in seasonal timing of fire, it's likely going to influence what vegetation is going to be able to come back in the landscape. And with that said, it's the end of my presentation, so at this point I can take any questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Eli. I have a question here. I'm going to ask you to repeat it because I'm not sure if my voice is going to carry through the system or not. Question from Cloquet. Did any plots succeed to not forest after the fires?
Yeah, actually, in the Cavvy Lake fire, I've selected out just the ones that did come back. Yeah, that Cavvy Lake fire was quite severe, and again, we were measuring just regeneration in a 3-meter radius plot, and you could see from some of those photos that if you measured 3 meters out, in some of those you're just going to run into rock. So, yeah, the Cavvy Lake fire tended to be patchier, and there was patches that weren't coming back as forest, and were probably going to be bare bedrock for I don't know how long it takes moss to regrow and cover boulders, but in some cases on south-facing slopes in the boundary waters, that's all there is for soil is really a moss layer, not a soil layer, but a moss layer that trees actually grow in. And if you have a hot late-season fire and that cooks all that moss, and you have bare bedrock, it's pretty hard for a tree to grow in bare bedrock. So yeah, we absolutely did have some plots that didn't come back as forest. And again, I showed that data of shrub composition, and we had some plots that, again, this is a wilderness area, but if I was a forest manager, some of those plots that burned in the Ham Lake fire that were really shrubby would be a concern, losing the site. So, I mean, it's important to keep a long-term perspective. The question is, are these going to come back as forest? Well, yes, absolutely. If we go out 100 years in the future, these are all going to be forested again. They were forested before. They've survived fires in the past. These aren't long-term impacts, but they could be decade-long impacts. I mean, we could see, still 10, 20, 30 years after the Cavvy Lake fire that some of those areas are patchier and aren't really as dense forested. Or, in the Ham Lake fire, we could see areas that came back really heavy shrubs where, maybe there's scattered balsam fir and paper birch in those areas, but not really what we would call a closed canopy forest. So.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions online right now. Great, I was just going to ask. Go ahead.
Are aspen and birch doing so well because of their tolerance? So when that fire goes through and opens up the ground, are they popping out because of the sun hitting the ground?
Yeah, so the question was, are aspen and birch doing well because the fire came through and their tolerance for fire and their adaptation to fire? So
I mean the tolerance for the sun. I mean the sun's hitting it, so they're shading.
Oh, in terms of the regeneration?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one interesting thing about the boundary waters and shade tolerance is that actually a lot of the shade tolerant species regenerate right after fire alongside the shade intolerant species. It's a good question. if I measured 5 years in the, after fire, did I miss maybe, a pulse of some other, jack pine that initially germinated and then died out? Quite possibly. I mean, 5 years, we chose this kind of period of time following these fires as a good time to kind of measure things because we would already see some competition occurring and things to kind of sort themselves out. I think the reason that aspen and birch are doing so well here is that in large measure, the conifer seed sources were eliminated in a lot of cases by the fires. All these were relatively severe fires. And so they definitely reduced the amount of seed sources. And where we did find seeds, we found a lot more of those conifers. I mentioned that white cedar came back really well in some cases, which was sort of surprising. And that was areas that were, next to lake shores that didn't burn quite as hot, where there's still some surviving trees. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I was just wondering if it was similar to like a clear cut where you clear
Yep.
cut it and you get a...
Yeah, it is quite that, a clear cut that, the fire came through, the areas that were aspen beforehand, and, there was a lot of suckering. But, also the fire opened things up and we did get a lot of seeding of aspen, which is, again, kind of surprising. We don't think a lot about seed regeneration of aspen, but that Ham Lake fire in particular was almost perfect conditions for aspen to seed in, where we had early season fire. It released seed, probably a couple weeks after the Ham Lake fire came through, and then we had a lot of rain. The rain ended up actually putting the Ham Lake fire out, so we had a wet mineral soil seedbed, which is exactly what aspen needs. So that's partly the explanation of why aspen did really well there.
When you started this, did you have any prior information to go off of? Is this something that's been studied before? Did you kind of have a direction as far as what you were looking for out there, or was this sort of I'm going to try something and we'll see how it goes?
So the question was, what did I have before I started the study in terms of data and direction? So this is part of as I kind of alluded to, a much longer term study in the boundary waters. Really the study dates back to the mid 90s with Lee Freelick, who, along with Peter Reich, did some investigations of long-term changes in community composition on some of the islands on Seagull Lake in the boundary waters. And then those islands blew down in 1999, and that started the Blowdown study. And so a lot of the plots that I had in the study, originally were wind research plots. And then there happened to be a wildfire that burned through. And so then we had wind plus fire. And then, I came along and started grad school at the U and started trying to add things to this data set. This study was probably of the 3 chapters of my dissertation. This is the one that probably was the most original on my part. It really kind of grew out of just, I was collecting data during my first field season and really noticing some dramatic differences between early and late season fires, and that kind of prompted this further investigation into what's really going on here. Again, questions that I had about, is this really because the fire was hotter, or is there something else going on here? And, my initial hypothesis was that, all these differences are just because this late season fire burned so hot. It seemed pretty obvious that, there wasn't much soil and litter left, and so that explained why things were different. But, the interesting thing with doing this research was that, well, actually, differences were probably more to do with just the timing, the stochastic timing of fire. Paper birch doing really well in the fall versus the spring. And yeah.
Another question from Ely. Considering plant phenology after leaf drop, would you expect October burns would more closely resemble early season burns than late?
That's a good question. Because you're late enough into the season that it's later than any of the fires that I was investigating. So couple things going on. I mean, so you're probably going to have more consumption. Sorry, I don't know if I repeated the question, but the question was, would an October fire, have the same effects as a spring fire because it's occurring after the leaves have dropped? So a couple things going on. That's a good question. You might have probably increased burning of that litter and duff layer, similar to the late season fire. But yeah, in terms of phenology, I think that's a question for probably further research. I can speculate a little bit. I think it would still be relatively similar to the other late season fires, because even though the leaves have dropped, usually in September, a lot of the sugars and stuff and nutrients are starting to be drawn down into those root systems of the plants, even if the leaves haven't dropped quite yet. I mean, once the late season rolls around, those leaves have kind of set themselves. I mean, they're ready to go. or the plant's ready to lose them. So I would suspect that an October burn would still be relatively more similar to these other late season fires that occurred in July and September, just because the plant's already kind of undergoing those changes in physiology. But I don't know because I don't have data on that, but that'd be my best hunch at it.
So how much less stems per acre of trees were there? Like on average from fall to spring, would it be possible for a land manager to burn in the fall to still get
good regen?
Adequate regen?
So the question was how many stems per acre early versus late season fire, and from a management standpoint, would you still have enough stems to consider a stand fully stocked with those late season fires? Off the top of my head, I'd have to like run through the data, and it's all in metric, so I can't rattle off a quick stems per acre, but it was quite different early versus late season fire. I think in a lot of cases that a late season fire could work quite well for, getting adequate regeneration of, especially if you're trying to regenerate a pine species. With if you're doing it for prescribed fire, you're probably also going to do a little bit of maybe some supplemental planting and seeding regardless. But yeah, I think the right prescribed fire in the fall could definitely give you the right effects. So when thinking about use of prescribed fire, again, we got to think about the direct fire effects. And so you could have a late season fire, and you could hopefully plan a burn window where you get the right severity out of it, that you're not going to do too much harm to the site. I think most forest managers would not want to go out and burn things as hot as the Cavity Lake fire got, where things burn down to bare bedrock, and you're not going to have forest for 50, 60 years. So a window of opportunity is important, but yeah, especially if you're trying to do some sort of aspen to pine conversion, you would probably really want to consider a late season fire to knock back that aspen. It's definitely, and same thing with hazel. This isn't anything new that I presented in terms of hazel management. Buckman back in the 60s found essentially the same thing. If you want to hurt hazel, burning later into the growing season really is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck in terms of controlling competition. And I think the same would go for aspen, because both species tend to have kind of similar physiology and phenology. So yeah, absolutely, late season fires could still be used, but again, fire severity is also important. So writing the right prescription and having the right conditions for the burn are also important.
Great questions. Any others here in Grand Rapids?
Would you think that directly after leaf out would be better than later in the fall, because most of those root reserves are taken up by just creating leaves?
It's a good question. So could you target fire directly after leaf out? Yes, but it might be really difficult to do. Usually that leaf out period tends to be right about when moisture is really high in the soil. And also, remember that there are other things like fire effects going on here still. So, if you have that higher soil moisture, maybe you're not, again, if you're trying to knock back aspen and favor pine, a fire right after leaf out might not get enough consumption of that litter and duff layer to expose mineral soil. So it's really kind of a tricky thing. Historically, from what we know about the fire history from Bud Heinzelman, most of the big fires in the boundary waters tended to be either really early in the spring before leaf out, or July, August, and September. And I think most of our fire management in the state, that's really, we have a spring fire season. Some years we don't get a fall fire season. When we do, it tends to be kind of a bad one. So it would be possible. I think you would have a good top kill on aspen if you could get it, but also getting the right fire effects might be trickier. So probably the safer opportunity is to do something a little bit later in the growing season.
All right. Well, Eli, thank you. That was a good presentation, especially considering the mix-ups at the beginning. So I appreciate your bearing with us. And likewise, thanks to everyone online and a great group here in Grand Rapids. I appreciate it. Those of you watching online, watch the chat pod for a link from Madison to request continuing education credits. Those of you here in Grand Rapids, talk to me if that's something that you're interested in. Couple of things coming up, another webinar in about a month. Check our website for details on that. We'd love to have you join us again. And We have a workshop coming up March 13th, I think it is, on smoke management tools that you can use, especially during prescribed burns, but sort of a related topic to the one we're doing here. Trent Wickman with the Forest Service Eastern Region is going to be in town to present that at MIFC, again, right here in Grand Rapids, March 13th. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate it, and thanks for bearing with the technical issues. We'll see you next time.